I'm joined today by Casey Chilton. Casey, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Casey Chilton. I am a senior lecturer at Texas State University in the Department of Communication Studies. I'm also the director of our speaking lab, also known as the Comm Lab, where folks come to practice their presentations. I have been a faculty member at Texas State since 2005 and at Austin Community College since 2003. So I've been teaching quite a long time.
You're here today to talk about group facilitation and how we can be better facilitators. Most of the time, the company, the organization is going to turn to the communication major for these kinds of tasks. What are some of the biggest challenges we should be aware of as we enter that workforce group facilitation situation?
The writer Dave Barry, columnist, author, screenplay writer, he very famously said, if you had to identify in one word why the human race has not achieved and never will achieve its full potential, that word would be meetings. People really have a problem with meetings, and one of the reasons they do is the lack of strong facilitation, not overbearing facilitation, but somebody with the necessary skills to lead the group discussion and make sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate. We get so flustered when we feel like we can't contribute or we feel like we've been minimized.
I wonder what, in your opinion, sets people who are amazing facilitators apart from those who are not as good at facilitation. What are some of those kinds of skills or qualities that lead to the best group facilitation and the best led meetings?
It's basically two-sided. So there's the business that we have to take care of while we're at the meeting. We have an agenda, we have this point and that point, and we have to make this decision and that decision, those types of things. But it's also about keeping an eye on everybody in the meeting and showing an awareness for who's talking, who's not, who looks uncomfortable, who looks like they're just getting a little bit more overbearing with the topic at hand. So the job of a facilitator really to me is twofold. You have to care about the task ahead of you, but you also have to care about the people who are helping you to complete the task.
Casey, in your opinion, what are some of the most important skills, or do you have a framework that you use to help people be better group facilitators?
For me, the framework really has to favor the people side of what you're doing. So, what are some of the qualities or characteristics that separate great facilitators away from people who are just technical people? It's the same things that make good leaders, right? So they're a good coach. They set a good example. They set a good model. They model great communication behaviors. They empower the group. They don't micromanage the discussion. They let people express themselves. Empowerment to me is just so crucial. I actually gave a presentation in the fall, and we were talking about how to persuade people very quickly to believe in what you believe in. And one of these high school students that I was presenting to came up to me at the end of the session, and she said, I love the way you talk about communication. It's so empowering. And at that moment, I took that moment to kind of connect with that. And I said, that's actually how I define communication. I challenge my students to define communication in a single word. And over time, for me, that word has changed to empowerment. I really think that communication is empowering on all levels. So I think a facilitator empowers us to speak our minds, to speak up, to not hold back, to not hesitate. A great facilitator expresses interest in and concern for the success of each member of the group. Obviously, they have to be a good communicator. They're a good listener. They share information well. So you really have to care about the people who are doing the work, the people at the table, the people on the screen. And you have to make that very, very, very clear in your communication with them.
I love this idea of empowerment. And just to play devil's advocate, which is another facilitation skill, what are some disempowering things that a facilitator might do? What should we avoid? What are those common mistakes or pitfalls?
So not having a plan, right? Not having a discussion plan. We all know what an agenda is, but also not having the skill to put together a great agenda. That's one of the skills that I teach in my small group course, is how to put together a really effective agenda where you're not jumping around all over the place. Not only that, but also making sure that people have it ahead of time. Putting together a really solid discussion plan. Another pitfall that we can get into is assuming that everyone agrees even though not everyone has spoken up, or even though not everyone has had their opportunity to contribute to the discussion. We hear 3 or 4 voices and we just assume, oh, okay, so that's good. Like, it sounds like we all agree here, but there are maybe 7 or 8 other people at the table.
This is a hard job. Being a group facilitator is difficult. What are some of the common challenges or mistakes or pitfalls that people often make when they're in charge of group?
Well, for starters, not having a plan, not having a well-constructed agenda. In my small group classes, we actually have an assignment where we learn how to create a really great, effective meeting agenda, following a specific formula, following the bell curve format. And students really learn about, hey, what do we need to prioritize? What are the less important things? What do good discussion questions look like? How are they worded? There's this kind of basic rule out there that however long the meeting is supposed to be, it should take you at least that long to plan the meeting ahead of time. And I can't tell you how much time that I've spent over the years just in planning mode, getting ready for a meeting that ultimately went way shorter, not longer, but shorter than that, simply because it was well planned out ahead of time. So not having a plan is a big pitfall. Just kind of, walking in and thinking that everybody's going to be talking and have an opinion about these things. Another pitfall could be assuming that everybody agrees, even if not everyone has spoken up. Not everyone will speak up all the time. You hear 3 or 4 or 5 voices that are in agreement, and maybe there are 6 more people at the table who haven't said anything. Like, that right there should be an indicator. Knowing that some people just in general have not an aversion to communication exactly, but an anxiety about it. Myself, I have a very high level of anxiety when it comes to communicating with other people. Not so much in a one-on-one way, but anytime you add a 3rd or a 4th or a 5th person or more to that situation, I tend to start to shut down. And I've noticed that in myself, and I also see it in other people. And so for me, an experienced expert facilitator can sense that about other people, because, there are people who you'll never hear from. They'll never say anything. And it's easy to just ignore them and just assume that, hey, they're not interested in what we're talking about. They're not as fully committed to this group as everybody else who talks a lot more. It could just be that they have, that introverted nature, or as we like to study in our discipline, communication apprehension, that anxiety about communication. And so it's really easy to just kind of brush those people aside and assume, yeah, they're just not interested. And that could not be further from the truth.
You said bell curve format. Can you give us a little bit more insight?
Sure. So the bell curve format, so just think of the bell curve, the traditional bell curve, like in statistics. It's for when it comes to planning an agenda, it's arranging your discussion items from something that's less intense at the beginning of the meeting to a more intense to the most intense, and then you have a less intense item and a less intense item. So you're not jumping into the deep end of the pool right off the bat. Not everybody is sufficiently warmed up and ready to go at the beginning of a meeting. So you got to kind of, toss a softball topic at everybody, something that's easy, something that we can all come to an easy agreement on that won't take a lot of time. And then we can escalate to a more intense item. And when I say intense, I mean the things that are going to prompt more discussion than other items. Some things don't need to be talked about for an hour straight. Other things do. And so building the intensity level up to the peak, and then we have our falling action on the other side of the curve. And you also, you don't want to have people just completely emotionally exhausted after the first discussion item on your agenda, because then they're just going to go, okay, sure for the next one. Okay, sure for the next one. They're not going to give you everything they have.
Knowing that even communication majors struggle with this idea is an important insight into the human condition, because I think that apprehension is everywhere. Even those of us who are more extroverted, or those of us who like, engaging face to face with human beings, we have apprehension too at times. We get nervous and we get flustered just like everybody else. Just because we gain energy from that experience versus having it drain us. That's, I think, that one of the biggest differences, at least in my experience and the people that I talk to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I feel the same thing in my teaching, for example. I've been teaching these courses for a very long time. I feel like I know how I want to explain things, but that doesn't mean that I don't sit and rehearse every day, that I don't go through my stuff, that I don't say, well, I'm going to talk about this and we're talking about that. I'm going to get this example, that example. That apprehension can be helpful in terms of making you be over prepared. But that is almost the same way as facilitating, in that you are leading the discussion. You're not necessarily a participant. There is a huge psychological difference between the teacher and the student, between the facilitator and every other group member at the table. So I think, people who tend to be more extroverted, usually go for these leadership roles and these facilitator roles. But I think really it's incumbent upon them to understand and to know that not everyone is as extroverted as they are. And I think that also brings in another part of the framework for facilitating, and that is just simple empathy, right? So understanding, knowing that there are certain people who are just terrified of speaking up in a group of 5 or a group of 8 or a group of 12 or a group of 15, and empathizing with that and going, okay, so now that I understand how this experience feels for someone, what can I do to help you overcome that and feel more confident and feel more comfortable? So that sense of empathy leads to a greater understanding, and then that understanding leads to action on the part of the facilitator.
Can you talk a little bit more about ownership in meetings?
Well, the problem is that people who experience higher levels of anxiety communicating in general, and especially in groups and meetings, there's actually a huge body of research out there that talks about what happens with these people. So for example, people that have higher levels of apprehension are more likely to miss meetings, to skip meetings. It affects their level of participation. So the higher the apprehension, the less they tend to participate. They're much less likely to be considered for leadership. Leadership is communication. So if somebody is afraid to communicate, then I don't know that they can be a very effective leader if they can't get past that. It impacts, people with higher levels of apprehension experience much less satisfaction working in groups. The task satisfaction is down, more prone to groupthink, that thing where we agree just to avoid conflict. So I know there's a problem with what we're talking about here, but I'm just going to keep it to myself, and I'm just going to go along with what the group wants, even though I see a huge glaring flaw here that nobody else seems to see. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut because I am too afraid to communicate about it. I am afraid of the repercussions of disagreeing with the majority, what sounds like the majority, which in fact could be a minority of voices. 3 people out of 10 championing a cause, and other people sitting there, in their minds going, I don't really think I agree with that, but I don't want to disrupt the flow right now, so I'm just going to keep it to myself. I'm not going to say anything.
I remember assigning a devil's advocate was really a wonderful strategy for overcoming groupthink. Can you give us some other insights on how to fight groupthink? Because I know it's been connected to everything from the Challenger disaster to 9/11 to so many things have been connected to a failure to challenge ideas.
There are so many ways to minimize groupthink, and lucky for us, they're all communication. They're all very easy. They're free. We don't have to, there are no solutions that we have to pay for here. Things like acknowledging, a status difference in the group. Like if you have somebody who's facilitating that's of a higher status level and that, then, asking everybody else what they think first before you interject your opinion or your thought or your feeling. Breaking the group. If it's a large group, we tend to experience more anxiety with larger groups and smaller groups. If it's a larger group, breaking the group up into smaller groups, having them confer with each other, and then, so what do we think about this? And then every small faction assigns a spokesperson to share what we came up with. It's easier to talk to 3 people than it is to talk to 12 people or 14 people. Things like, encouraging people to write down their ideas instead of, pressuring them to voice them out loud. Even now with things like Zoom and Teams, you can use the chat function to share ideas in addition to the people who feel comfortable saying them out loud. There are so many easy ways to circumvent this groupthink thing, but A, you have to know what groupthink is and why it's such a horrible thing, and B, what are some of the really easy strategies for just completely getting it out of the mix.
I love that. And this leads nicely into another framework or way of doing things. Do you have a way that you like to organize problem solving in groups? I know you spoke about the bell curve and organizing tasks, but what about we have a problem to solve? How do we lead that problem solving adventure?
There are just so many different ways that we can structure problem solving. It honestly, and this is the metaphor that I like to use with my small group classes. But I show them a picture of this tiny little toolbox with like one screwdriver and a hammer and a ruler and one wrench. And I go, you know what? This is the skill set. So this is the toolbox that most people out there are working with. They have the absolute minimal basic skills to collaborate in groups. I mean, they can obviously do their jobs, but when it comes to collaboration, they have very minimal toolbox. And so I show them a picture of this little tiny toolbox, and I go, this is what most people have. By the end of our semester together in this small group class, and then I show this massive toolkit with all these levels and drawers and all the, every single piece of information, every skill, every theory, every methodology that we learn about this semester is just one more tool in the toolbox. And so you're going to have every possible tool for every possible occasion. And so it's really up to the person facilitating to determine, well, what is the complexity of this task? Is this something that we can accomplish fairly easily and quickly? Great. We don't need a lot of structure. We don't need a lot of back to this, back to this, back to this. So we can take a more, say, descriptive approach. Or if it's something that is going to take a while and we're going to need to really employ a higher level of structure, there's prescriptive problem solving based on the, reflective thinking, things like that. And so all of these concepts that we learn are just extra tools in the toolbox, and we can pull them out at just the right time. And then that's the idea that I really try to impress upon my students is it's the right tool for the right job at the right time. It's not the only way to do something. It's just one more option that you'll have to be able to put out there on the table for everyone.
What are some of your favorite problem-solving tools in that toolbox? And I love the toolbox metaphor, because the toolbox metaphor can lead into so many other things in the communication discipline, right? We've got our group facilitation toolbox, and we have our other parts of our discipline toolboxes too. But what are some of your favorite tools?
The first thing that I try to do with my students is impress upon them, because we call it problem solving doesn't mean that we're in crisis mode. A problem can be a problem of innovation. A problem can be, hey, we raised X amount of money last year for the people that we serve. Let's increase that by 25% this year. So we're not doing badly. We're not doing poorly. We just think we can do better. And so, most of the problems that we attack are problems of innovation. We want something to be better. So let's apply problem solving process to innovating that. So I think, having that understanding and having that, frame around everything kind of helps us to understand, okay, problem doesn't automatically mean bad. There are so many different tools that we learn about, different theories, things like systems theory and things like symbolic convergence theory, where we talk about the value of personal stories and narratives, because personal stories not only connect us to each other, they also help us to understand the problem that we're working on better. I mean, so much of our understanding of a problem doesn't necessarily come from the hard data that we collect, but somebody saying, so this is how this problem impacted me this time, and they share this personal story. And it's not based on cold, hard facts. It's their experience. And you're automatically trying to link it to, is my experience like theirs, or is my experience different from theirs? And that promotes discussion, and that promotes just more elaboration on the problem at hand. But then you have all of the wonderful decision-making methods that we learn about, and all of the amazing, ways that we can structure brainstorming and make sure that people are getting the most out of their personal creativity, and the rules of brainstorming and things like that. Those are some of my favorite tools in the toolbox, but there are just so many.
Can you talk specifically about some of those brainstorming strategies that you use with groups?
So there are different types of brainstorming that we talk about. There's the good old-fashioned sit around the table and just yell out your ideas, which can be very intimidating for some people, particularly those who are more anxious about communicating. There are, techniques where you write down your ideas and then you share them out loud, and then you write down some more ideas and you share them. And, all of those things, kind of come together to make it a more effective session. So basically employing a little bit of structure into that messy, chaotic, creative process. So having an understanding of the basic rules. So, not evaluating ideas, which at first was the rule of brainstorming. It was the single rule. Now it's, hey, once an idea leaves your mouth, it's not your idea anymore. It's our idea. We can do with it whatever we want. Making sure that we're piggybacking, taking people's ideas and modifying them to make new ideas. Making sure that we're stressing quantity. I mean, this is one of the things that I really impress upon my students, is that when brainstorming, it's all about the sheer number of ideas. And for example, we work on an assignment where they have to come up with a slogan in a very short period of time to address a particular problem or issue. And I brainstorm ideas. I go, please note that I did not say brainstorm slogans. just brainstormed ideas. They can be 2 words, or they can be half a slogan or half an idea. Everything has potential value after we're done brainstorming. We can take those ideas and put them together. So, making sure that we're recording all of the ideas, making sure that we're rewarding all of the ideas. All of these are different ways of encouraging people to be creative, while at the same time making sure that we're getting the most focus out of what they're doing right now.
And whenever it's time to evaluate, what kind of criteria do you use?
Sometimes, occasionally, you will be given criteria ahead of time. Sometimes, whoever assigns you this task says, and here are some criteria for you. But groups generally come up with their own criteria. And I give a really fun example of, spontaneous criteria generation from, this experience that Sandy and I have, where we, after Thanksgiving, we go toy shopping, and we take all of these toys down to Laredo, Texas, to Sacred Heart Children's Home. And that's just one of our annual traditions that we do. And, the very first time that we went toy shopping together, we weren't agreeing on anything. Now, the important thing to know here is that, hey, this is my money and this is your money. We can buy whatever we want. We don't necessarily have to agree on the toys that we're buying for these kids, but it would be nice if we did agree on it, so that we weren't kind of looking at each other going, can't believe you would give that to a kid. So we stopped in the middle of toy shopping, and we just basically put everything back on the shelves, and we went over to the tire section of the store where it was nice and quiet. And so what makes an appropriate toy? And we sat and we came up with like 4 or 5 different criteria. It should be this, it should not be that. And so groups do that also. We did this interpersonally in a matter of a few minutes, just by thinking through, based on what we know about our target audience, based on what we know about the people that we're working on this problem for. And again, that's where that empathy thing comes into play. One of the things that I remind people all the time is never forget who you're solving this problem for. That promotes a better understanding of them, so that you can gear your solution toward them much more easily. So think like a child living in a children's home, okay, with a bunch of other kids, whether, whatever their gender is, doesn't really matter at this point. What are some things that I would appreciate? What are some things that I would want in something that's durable, that will last, that, is shareable? Just thinking about how, people live on a day-to-day basis and how they live with these things. So that's just an anecdotal example, but groups themselves, they generate criteria based on their understanding of the problem. So we're seeing that these are the major impacts of this problem here. And so our solution should be geared toward those negative impacts.
I'm glad that you reintroduced that idea of audience as central, because it is one of those critical axioms of the communication discipline that we keep coming back to.
Well, I agree with that. And I mean, when I think about giving a presentation, so much of your audience adaptation happens before you walk up there and start speaking, right? You have to gear the message to your audience, and you have to gear your behavior toward the audience, and you have to think about who they are. How much do they know about the topic ahead of time? How deeply can I go? How much time do I have? All those types of things. And then, of course, you're adapting to your audience during. If you see people that have puzzled looks on their faces and things like that, you can shift gears, and you can say, let me go back to this and give you an even better example, I think, than I gave the one before. The thing that differentiates that from the group experience is that we're all sitting around this table, or we're all sitting in front of our computers on these screens. We are so much more heavily involved and invested with these people, because we typically meet with them again and again and again and again and again. You can never guarantee that you're ever going to see anybody from your audience in your presentation ever again. These are people that we have working relationships with. And so there is a certain level of intimacy and involvement there that really demands that we focus on the people just as much as we're focusing on the problem at hand.
Tell me a little bit about how you plan before you go into that group facilitation experience. What can a good group facilitator do to prepare?
There are things to do before the meeting, okay? So having that well-planned agenda, making sure that you've arranged these different items and these different tasks so that it's comfortable for people, not just jumping into the deep end of the pool right off the bat and expecting people to swim, and they're not ready to swim just yet. So having that, but also, when it comes down to the meticulous creation of the discussion question. So, it's not just a laundry list of topics that we're talking about today. You need to be able to create great questions that people know how to answer. And so in creating those questions, it all comes down to just being really meticulous about the wording of them. And I think the problem is that a lot of people really just don't want to put in the necessary time to thinking about all of the possible response options to a single question. What if somebody answers it this way? What if somebody answers it that way? Would I even understand that question if I were being asked that question? So for me, the planning process for anything just has to be meticulous. It's the same as when I'm putting together an exam for a class. I don't just slap an exam together the day before. I go through each question repeatedly, and I look at each choice, A, B, C, D, whatever the format is, and I go, is there any word in there that could confuse somebody, that they could, confuse with another concept? And if then I have to take that out. I have to rework that choice, or maybe even rework the item itself. So I think that there's just so much meticulous planning that has to go in on the front end, but then it doesn't end there. We have the actual meeting, right? And so when we have the actual meeting, there are other things that we do as facilitators to make sure that people are getting the most out of the experience.
I'm sure you have success stories from applying your meticulous planning in group facilitation. Can you think of a specific success story that might help illustrate the power of setting aside that time in advance to do that cognitive work and take on that cognitive load before you actually step into that room?
Even though I've been teaching even longer than from 2003, I'm actually a certified teacher in the state of Texas for secondary speech. So I've been teaching since 2000. But I taught high school, and then I taught in graduate school, and I continued teaching even though I was working a different job, because teaching is the thing that I love most. So I served as the director of academic advising for the College of Education at Texas State for about a year and a half before I joined the faculty full-time in communication studies. And so, here I am with my shiny new degree, and, I'm the director of this, something that I don't know anything about at all. So I had to take a little bit of time and learn, here's how it goes, here's how it goes, here's how it goes. And so one of my first responsibilities was, okay, at a certain point, you're going to need to take over facilitating the meetings. And I'm going, okay, yeah, sure, great. So I'll sit in on a few, and I'll see how they flow, and I'll see the types of things that we talk about. I'll see the person who's facilitating right now, how they do things, and, what I can do to improve upon that. And so we sat down for, Casey's first meeting, right? And it didn't take nearly as long as the other meetings that we had had, because I spent a lot of time looking over the topics that we were going to talk about, and the basic structure of the meeting, making sure that was solid. And, I made sure that everybody had their say, and I made sure to acknowledge, somebody who hadn't talked yet. I said, well, what do you think about this? How do you feel about that? By the end of the meeting, which again ended sooner, because there weren't these long, drawn-out pauses where nobody was saying anything and nobody was prompting people to say anything. At the end of the meeting, I had a couple of people. One of them actually had a degree in communication as well. She came in, by my desk, and she says, that was the best meeting we have ever had. Usually our meetings are just death, because there were weekly meetings on Wednesday afternoons from like 3:30 to 5. So end of the day, right? And it could have been worse. It could have been Friday from 3:30 to 5. She said, that was the best meeting we have ever had. I actually feel energized. If that's possible, to feel energized after a meeting, I feel like we got so much accomplished, and I didn't walk away just shaking my head. And she's like, did you notice that so-and-so talked and so-and-so talked? They never say anything. They never speak up at these things, but they actually talked at this meeting. That right there, that was just kind of the shot in the arm that I needed right there. Because I was learning a new job, and I wasn't exactly, well-versed in this academic advising world. And so, anything that I could do to make the experience better for anybody, whether it was students or staff or whomever, anything that I could do at that moment to show, hey, look, this is something that we're all in together. That was great.
So how did you accomplish that? Specifically the part where people who didn't speak before are speaking up.
So number one, knowing how to I keep coming back to this, knowing how to put together an agenda that was, thorough, but also at the same time organized well. So that was a hit, because, you rehearse, it's almost like you rehearse the meeting ahead of time, even though you never know what people are going to say. You never know what contributions or what opinions they're going to share. It's, giving you a game plan, basically, right?
So those introverts spoke up more because you had a game plan.
That's part of it. So that is what happens before the meeting, right? That's the planning that goes in before the meeting. I think when it comes to, and making sure that people know what we're going to be talking about ahead of time so that they can kind of cobble some thoughts together ahead of time if they want to do that, if they need that. Like, I'm the kind of person who really, really appreciates seeing an agenda at the very least the day before so that I can go through and make a few notes. Do I want to talk about this? What do I want to say about that? As opposed to seeing an agenda for the first time right in front of you at the meeting going, wow, I didn't know we were going to talk about this. Or I don't know how I feel about that right now. You know what I mean? But not just the planning, but also what you do during the meeting, setting a norm of what Google likes to call psychological safety. In one of their published studies, they do all these self-studies. And, one of the things that, excellent, what they call managers, but I will call facilitators here. One of the things that they do is they build in psychological safety. This is a safe space for people to express themselves, even if it's not a popular opinion. We'll respect, we'll listen, and that encourages people to share, period. So creating this, sense of psychological safety. During the meeting, we really, really, really stress something that we call gatekeeping in small group. This is one of the concepts that I hit over and over. And by the end of the semester, I go, so what do we call that, y'all? My students say, I'll go, gatekeeping, all this, because they've heard me say it so many times. So in a typical group, you are going to have more dominant talkers. Now, dominant talkers in the sense, not that they're necessarily trying to dominate the discussion, they're just more extroverted. They're more willing to communicate their thoughts, feeling. Maybe they're just even more passionate about the topic at hand right this minute. And you're going to have other people who talk less as a norm. They're just a little more hesitant. They're a little more anxious about communicating. And so making sure this thing called gatekeeping. So literally what it means is, if you think about a gate, right, you close the gate on the people that have contributed so far, and you open the gate through invitation to make sure that people who haven't yet had a chance to speak up get a chance to speak up. And the really great thing about gatekeeping is that you can do it spontaneously, or you can build it into your process. I've seen it happen both ways, and I've done it both ways. So for example, when I've been on a hiring committee, the person leading the discussion will say, okay, so how did we feel about that candidate? I want to hear from you first. I want to hear from you next. I want to hear from you next. I want to hear from you next, right? That is building in that. So Casey, what did you think? Marsha, what did you think? And then we go around, and then it's the same pattern every time. So it's very strategic, but at the same time, it's not just a free for all. So it's building in some structure there to make sure that everyone feels included. Now, that's in a strategic way. It can also be a very spontaneous thing. You suddenly realize, wow, we've been talking about this for 10 minutes, and this person, and this person have not yet said a word. So I'd like to hear from someone who hasn't had a chance to weigh in yet. Or, hey, Casey, how do you feel about this? That's what we call gatekeeping. Other ways to encourage people who are a little bit more, hesitant to speak up are, hey, if you're not comfortable speaking out loud, why don't you write down your thoughts? Why don't you write down your ideas? And that's especially helpful now, with Zoom meetings and team meetings, where if someone, maybe feels drowned out by all the voices that are competing, they can use the chat feature, and it's like, well, what about this, or what about this, or what about this?
Empathy equals empowerment, and structure equals freedom. All of that planning and all of that layering in of the group facilitation skills and the process that helps to move the conversation forward and get things done.
Yes, structure matters. Structure is important, but not at the cost of the emotional tone of what's going on, and not at the cost of leaving people out of the discussion. So it's the right kind of structure at just the right time. That's what I continually emphasize. A discussion doesn't need to be so highly structured that it gets boring and repetitive and routine, and people are just going, and now you're going to go to this person, and then you're going to go to that person. There needs to be that energy. There needs to be that spontaneity too.
So popcorn style is important too, even if it's planned popcorn style conversation, because you have that tension between empathy and structure. Even though we think of those things as maybe not as related, there is a tension there, it sounds like. How do you evaluate when you've been successful? How do you know that it's working in the room? And how do you know afterwards that you've been a success?
The first thing that you have to keep in mind is that it's not immediate. It takes time. It's really hard to undo, let's say somebody's 25 years old or 30 years old. It's really hard to undo 30 years of experience in a 60-minute meeting. So this is something that you're sowing seeds at the very beginning, and you're sowing those expectations, and it takes time for people to get comfortable and to open up, and a lot of times that happens through just interpersonal conversations, not in the meeting space. So I was like, hey, I wanted to check in with you. So particularly if somebody has, you realize, this person doesn't speak up a lot. Maybe they have a little bit more anxiety about this, meeting with them one-on-one, just, casual conversation. Hey, just out of curiosity, how do you think our meetings are going lately? Or is there anything that you'd change about them? Those types of things. To me, that's just as much as building that relationship as when we're sitting at the table. It's almost like a form of mentoring, in my opinion. So I think over time, people get comfortable and they start to open up more, and they start to realize, oh, okay, my contributions aren't just appreciated, they're actually needed. People need to hear my voice. People need to hear my ideas, my thoughts, my opinions on things, because those are actually being used to help us make the decisions that we need to make. So people notice, people recognize how much effort you're putting in to run a successful meeting, to run a successful discussion. They recognize those things, and they may not come right out and say it, but you'll see it indirectly in the fact that more people participating more, people feeling very comfortable doing that. But also, they may come to you in a one-on-one situation and say, I used to really dread coming to these meetings because I would just sit there and, not think that anybody cared what I had to say. But I realize now that, what I do have to say matters. And so, I just want to thank you for that. And, at the end of it, you're doing your job. You're just doing your job. It's something that you elected to take on. But just to get that confirmation. So it comes from just the overall participation in the group, but it can also come outside the group, outside the meeting.
I'm thinking about all the different instances where people have said, wait a second, do we really need to have this meeting? And I hear you talking about the success story and how different that conversation would be because, oh, well, we just always have meetings on this day and time, so we're just meeting for the sake of meeting. And I know that if we had better facilitation skills, that kind of thinking would probably not pop up as much because we had such an empathetic leader. Can you talk about the connection between leadership and group facilitation? The body of research of leadership seems to have a lot in common with a lot of the skills, a lot of the empathy, a lot of the empowerment, a lot of the planning that you're talking about here today.
For better or worse, a lot, if not most of the people who facilitate meetings tend to be the leader of the group. I think that they find that that's an expectation, even if they don't have the skills to do it well. And I think that could be part of the problem. Because if you're facilitating, what are you doing? You're leading discussion, right? You're not leading the participants to the conclusion that you want. You're simply managing the discussion that's going on through the structure that you introduce, but you're also encouraging interaction, not just with you, but with each other. Let's agree on this. Let's disagree on this. I want to hear everybody on this, right? So you're managing interaction, but you're also encouraging interaction. And so a lot of leaders take that leadership role the next step, and they facilitate group meetings and group discussions.
And that next step makes all the difference, doesn't it? So our next step is, what is the most important action that people listening today can take to become that superstar facilitator, that go-to person in their organization that knows how to manage a meeting effectively? What's that core skill or action?
If I were to just sum it up, I would say keep your eyes open, pay attention to everyone at the table. Look for those people in the group who might need a little nudge, who might need some one-on-one time, maybe a little bit of mentoring, those types of things, to help them gain that confidence to want to participate in our discussions.
Attention is such a scarce resource, and it seems to be scarcer every day. So the things that we need to pay attention to, it sounds like, are the individuals that are making up the group. What else do we need to really pay attention to?
Those strategies that we've been talking about, so there's this really great quote. So the great Neil Peart, drummer for the progressive rock band Rush, he had this really great quote that I just absolutely love. And he was giving an interview and he says, "What is a master but a master student?" And if that's true, then there's a responsibility on you to keep getting better and to explore avenues of your profession, right? So I hope you don't mind me reading that quote out there. I just didn't want to misquote him. Always making sure that you're doing the things that are necessary, but also, like, don't ever get complacent. make sure that you stay, because there are books and books and books and books and guides and all these manuals and all that on facilitating. And every one of them has, little nuggets of things that you can pull from to go, okay, I'll try this next time. It's just, again, it's all tools in the toolbox. And so as a facilitator, you might think that you've reached a point where you're going, okay, my skill set is complete. And I don't think that that's true. I think there's always something that we can learn about to make the experience better the next time and the next time and the next time.
I love the way you answer that question, because the attention isn't necessarily on them in that case. The attention is on ourselves, because as the old quote goes, when the student is ready, the master appears, right? And we are always learning. We are always adding to our infinite toolbox that you described to make those tools and shape those tools in ways that will serve our end goals for our teams, because we can accomplish so much more as a group than we can as individuals. And having this specific individual skill of being able to manage group processes, it can lead to some amazing things and amazing accomplishments. Casey, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us where we can find you online.
Well, I don't honestly have much of an online presence, but you can get in touch with me through the Texas State website, our Communication Studies Department website there. My contact, my email, my office phone number. If you ever want to reach out and talk about any of these concepts more in depth, I'm all for it.
Casey, again, thank you so much for the time and the insights and the wisdom of group facilitation.